Ted Cruz gave a speech last night where he most notably did not actually endorse the man who invited him to speak at the convention, and the reaction during the speech was not positive, and the reaction in the 24 hours since then has been even worse, perhaps, for Ted Cruz. Conservatives very angry. Here is a brief sampling.
Start with Ted Cruz that we know in Washington, D.C., who is a self-absorbed, narcissistic individual. It's all about Ted Cruz. America now knows that. He's now a small man who is not with the Republican Party.
Ted Cruz showed America what he really is. He's a fraud, he's a liar, he's self-centered, and he disqualified himself for ever being considered for president of the United States.
It was an awful, selfish speech by someone who tonight, through the words he said on that stage, showed everybody why he has richly earned the reputation that he has on Capitol Hill.
Last night, Ted Cruz did the impossible. He turned Donald Trump into a victim.
He was circling the runway. We all thought he was going to land the plane. Instead, he crashed it. It was an absolutely dishonorable moment.
I don't understand how someone can present themselves as a person of integrity and then come into this room tonight and give that cute speech he gave.
And he's not a true Republican, he's not a true conservative, he's totally self-centered. And I never saw such outrage and anger on the floor as I saw Ted Cruz tonight, and he deserved every bit of it. He's a total fraud.
What Ted Cruz did last night, I was astonished. I'm extremely disappointed in him.
He earned his moniker last night that Donald Trump had attributed to him, Lying Ted. There's a new Broadway play, Lion King 2. It's going to be opening up on Broadway.
I just think it was an awful performance by someone who showed himself tonight to not be a man of his word.
They gave him enough rope to hang himself, and he followed through on that.
He dishonored himself and the convention. I'm absolutely disgusted with what he did last night.
All right, I think this has hurt him profoundly. I think this has done lasting damage.
This is possibly the most Cuban thing he could have done. He's Cuban American. It's a pride thing.
Ted Cruz moves self-absorbed.
It's not so much his message we disagree with, it's him as a human being and as a person.
Ted Cruz, the self-absorbed, narcissistic individual.
He disgraced himself, he disgraced the party, and the party should never consider him again for office.
They know now Ted Cruz, the self-absorbed individual.
We can live without Ted Cruz, and I think it's good that America saw what Ted Cruz is all about.
He's ended his own career.
Jeez. Okay, so coming out of that, the only good news is that if you're a fan of Lion King, there is a second one. It's going to be on Broadway. I can't wait to see it.
That's such a Cuban joke.
I know. Stop being so Cuban. God damn it.
It's going to hurt Huckabee next time he runs for president.
Exactly.
I can't understand, though, how'd they feel about it?
Yeah, totally.
How'd they feel?
Yeah, how'd that go over in the Republican Party?
Lion
Brilliantly. You know, I talked before we came on with someone who worked for the Cruz campaign. I was just walking in the hottest city in America with someone who worked on the Cruz campaign. The Cruz people have been waiting for this for a long time. The people that were in the trenches with them, that wanted Ted Cruz to attack Donald Trump a lot earlier than he did, who didn't want him to, sort of lay over. The other thing to remember about Ted Cruz that I looked up again today because I had forgotten it. He's 45 years old.
Yeah.
Right?
He's young.
His politics are not that of a 45-year-old. But he doesn't care about this election now. He doesn't even care perhaps about 2020. He could look at 24, 28, 32 and not have to worry about what he's saying and doing here. He stood up for himself and a quieter...
Well, Michael, his career is over.
What?
Yeah, exactly. His career's over. They made that it's over.
It's all that he's
Was that
done.
Huckabee saying that, by the way?
Yeah.
Who's Huckabee?
No,
Seemed like it was everybody.
Peter King said it.
Oh, Peter King said that.
Never fit
Oh,
for
well, he's
office.
at least still
Do you
in
remember
office.
Peter King was going to run for office this year? Like he
he
was
was going to be number 18.
Number 18. So to set the stage a little bit more, we want to show you this picture. It's a screenshot of the Trump family while the speech was going on. If you can see the faces, Donald Trump looks extremely unhappy. That is actually just how he looks. But his son is not happy during this speech. He was not a fan.
Were they were in their seats?
Yes, that's them in their seats.
Well, my understanding is that Trump came in the middle of the speech. That it was like a WWE moment. Like as he's speaking, Trump starts to. Roland Martin was telling me about this. I was interviewing him on TYT interviews. Check that out on youtube.com/TYT interviews. And he said he was in the room, and all of a sudden the entire room pivoted and looked in the opposite direction of Ted Cruz. He's like, "What in the world's going on? Is there a fight?" He looks and he's like, "Oh my God, Donald Trump just walked in." So Donald Trump, having seen the speech ahead of time, but only a little bit ahead of time, decided, "Oh, you're going to Bigfoot me? No, I'm going to Bigfoot you." And then the New York delegation is the one that starts to chant, of endorse Trump, endorse Trump.
Yeah.
Now, I talked to somebody at the New York delegation last night, and they said, yes, Trump met with us beforehand, but no, he did not tell us to boo him or anything along those lines. But now remember, he might have told a couple of people in the New York delegation, not everybody, and then they're the ones who precipitated this whole thing.
Yeah.
But they did not have a lot of time before Cruz's speech, because Cruz gave a speech, I think, at the last minute. So they by the time Trump walks in, they know.
Trump
but
said he
earlier,
got it 2 hours early. But
that's right, but he's lying. I mean, our sense of it is
so.
that.
Getting in touch with the New York, setting that up, that could have been 2 hours. It's not, like you said, you could have needed, you might have needed 3 or 4 guys. Yeah.
Well, look, if Cruz is as clever as I think he thinks he is, I would have just put the endorsement in the speech and then not said it. That way you don't give them any warning. He pulled a Ned Stark. He let them know that he wasn't going to support. I don't know. The metaphor falls apart. But
he did Ned Stark, but that would have been harder to come back from.
Yeah,
then,
that would be a bigger lie.
Then you are lying, Ted.
Yeah, but he's a liar. He's a liar. He's a lion Ted. He's starring in Lion King 2. Okay, we've passed that. He's a liar.
But in this case, by the way, that is the one thing they threw at him that wasn't true.
Right.
He never lied.
Yeah. He never said he would endorse them.
Yeah. And then he
so far
said a
as we
speech
know.
where he didn't, and then he delivered that speech.
Right.
So coming out of the speech, we're going to have some more reactions, but I want to show you this tweet. Even Hillary Clinton, not as much of a conservative, but still getting on board with Vote Your Conscience. Of course, that has been used against her since then.
Yeah, I
in ways
think
having nothing to do.
Yeah, you got to be careful with that tweet.
Yeah, I would have thought a little bit more, but delete that tweet. But anyway, we do know that
even that little clever attempt to be every time I've seen it now 4 times, and I've gone every time.
Yeah. I can't believe 40 people on our Twitter team came up with that.
Yes. So as he was leaving, they said he'd been booed off the stage. I don't think he was booed off the stage. He was booed as he was leaving the stage, but he didn't stop his speech early.
Right, he was booed off the stage. His speech was over.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
he finished his
technically,
speech.
booed off the stage means
you
your
have
speech
to
is
stop.
not over and
Right.
you left early. I know, but it was too close not to call it booed off the stage.
And the amount of booing, you usually don't see within the party this much booing. Mitch McConnell was booed twice. Ted Cruz historically booed last night.
Yeah.
And it just speaks to me about the way this party is right
Although
now.
I agree, except I suspect Hillary Clinton's going to get booed some.
Oh, you think so?
That's a
That'll be
possibility,
really
yeah.
interesting to see.
So
as much, but-
even his wife was targeted with screams of Goldman Sachs. After the speech, they then went and there were some members of various delegations. Steve Brusk of CNN says that behind the scenes, people called Cruz a disgrace to his face. One state chairman had to be held back. He was What's that?
I read it was the Washington State Chairman.
There are multiple descriptions of him being physically intimidated by delegates.
People
like they were
would
getting
make
up in
eye
his
contact
face.
with him.
Yeah.
And one more from Roland Martin. He said, again, he's on the floor. 2 delegations, one guy from Colorado and the other state I forgot. They said came nose to nose. Colorado was on Cruz's side, another state was on Trump's side.
Yeah.
And he said they came this close to blows.
Yeah. And also, Kevin Sorbo says, Senator Cruz, sorry, bud, but no class not to endorse Trump. Tired of all the phony conservatives in D.C. So he's able to identify a true, long-standing conservative in Donald Trump.
A real Herculean tweet.
Exactly. Oh, Jesus. And then let's see. It got a little bit more embarrassing. Outside of just the rhetoric, there were some immediate consequences for Ted Cruz. So he had previously been invited to Sheldon Adelson's executive suite. And so he goes after the speech to it, and he's stopped at the door. Senior Adelson aide Andy Aboud confirmed to CNN that his boss had invited Cruz to visit with him and his wife Miriam, but turned him away at the door because of what he said. Aboud said when he didn't endorse, they were stunned and disappointed. We could not allow Ted Cruz to use the Adelsons as a prop against Donald Trump. And then Donald Trump later put out a photo of him with the thumbs up standing next to the couple, to Adelson and his wife.
That actually was my favorite moment.
Yeah.
No, when he got booed, that was awesome. Okay, I can't stand Ted Cruz. So that historic moment where he is greeted with unprecedented disdain was delicious. Now, we'll get back to who was right and wrong about that, though, in a second.
Because there was a lot to delight in there.
Yeah, no, I hear you. But my second favorite moment is he goes to his donor immediately after the speech, and he's like, oh, how did I do, Daddy? How did I do? And he's like, you disgrace. Boom, slams the door on his face. I added a couple of words there. But still, and as he's walking away, picture it in your mind's eye, as he's walking away from Adelson's suite, he's thinking,
Shame.
oh yeah.
Shame.
Ding, 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 ding. No, but seriously, he's got to be thinking, have I made the miscalculation of my life? And there's some chance he did. Because it's one thing to piss off the voters, which I think he did, and we'll get into that discussion. But it's another thing to piss off the donors. And if he did that, boy, then he's in a real world of hurt.
But that's
an open question, too.
I think he did nothing to destroy any future Ted Cruz anything.
Yeah, Adelson is backing Trump now. Like, Adelson will back the person who he wants to influence. And so if Ted Cruz makes himself the obvious choice, then Adelson will go back to him.
He was the anti-Washington candidate before Donald Trump came along. When Donald Trump goes away, if he goes away as a former president, it's a little different. But if he goes away as a failed candidate who ran for president and didn't win, then Ted Cruz can recapture the mantle of the anti-Washington.
Yeah, totally. It was already partly his mantle. He doesn't play it right because he is way too slick to play it and seems, as you say, such a typical politician. But the fact is he's not a typical politician because most typical politicians loathe him. But the idea, I think I'm going to reframe what Michael's saying. I don't think he hurt himself either. We certainly don't know whether he hurt himself. There's so much time. And he will turn it into, I pissed off Donald Trump and I pissed off Sheldon Adelson. I stood up to the donors. I mean, if he's clever, he'll spin it. It hurts him right now, but he doesn't need anything right now.
You have to remember also in 2013, Ted Cruz was considered the biggest perpetrator of the government shutdown, right? Yeah. Everyone at that time said, the Republicans are shooting themselves in the foot. This is it. This is it. Ted Cruz, that we don't like you. We don't want. You're not part of our party. You're going against us here. He said this will be our success. In 2014, they won the Senate. So he has been taking stands like this that are unpopular even within his own party, and it's worked out in some way.
He recovered from that. He recovered from the thing on his face. He can bounce back. He's a comeback kid.
So I have the answer, luckily.
Oh, good. Let me get it.
Okay. Wait, first answer ever.
Write this down.
Okay, Ben's going to write it down.
This is like the McLaughlin group when everybody gives their opinion. Wrong!
That's right. It's not like I didn't listen and watch him. Okay, so here's the situation. Number one, I know what the play is. The play is for 2020, Trump's going to be a disaster. He's going to step in and say, who's the one guy who stood up to him and told you it was going to be a disaster, which is a perfectly rational play. Now, Kasich's doing the same thing, but in a Kasich style. Kasich's saying, I didn't go. Yeah. I got offered the VP. I didn't take it. It's going to be a disaster. I'm going to run in 2020, and I'm going to be the answer. They're ready to both Kasich and Cruz are ready to primary him today. And this was Cruz doing what Cruz does. Yeah. I'm going to go in there and slap everybody across the face, and I'm going to be the heel, but it's going to work out for me. So then it seems like I'm leaning towards Michael's position. Hey, he's done this before. That's a strategy. Nothing wrong. And back when he was doing all those filibusters, I thought, no, this will work with the base. Yeah. And then when you saw the Limbaughs at the time, et cetera, rallying to him, I'm like, oh, it's seven. And I had him in the Final Four, this Freak 16, et cetera. I thought he was going to do really well. This one, he overreached. Yeah. It was a miscalculation. Okay. Oh, because almost every Republican voter in the country now kind of despises him.
Okay.
And it's like, it was visceral. It was like I got that sense, not just from the politicians who already hated him, but like from the delegates, from everything I got. Of course I could be wrong.
But it's right. It's just, I think you're right, but it's right now. And they're in the middle of this race, and they hate him right now. And if Trump loses, and it can't be pinned on Cruz. Like, Trump loses, and everything's a disaster going forward, and making an argument that Ted Cruz cost him the election is going to be preposterous.
No, I don't think anybody can make that argument. I'm not saying that.
No. I know. I'm just saying that if Trump loses, and he loses bad because he trumped it up, right, then no one will care that Cruz did this, and in fact, many will praise him as having the foresight to stand up to him. I just think, I'll jack your mind at deciding now whether it damaged or hurt Ted Cruz is ridiculous. Maybe it did.
But guys, let me just set up the second part. We're going to continue with Ted Cruz, but we want to move on to his response. Despite massive criticism, the day after his big speech where he did not endorse Donald Trump, Ted Cruz is actually doubling down on that position, explaining it in part in a way that is a bit dishonest, but in part actually something I think a lot of people can probably get behind. And so in this video, you're going to see him talking to a number of delegates about why he couldn't endorse Donald Trump.
Tell you, when I stood on that debate stage, and they asked every candidate there, if you don't win, will you support the nominee? I raised my hand, and I raised my hand enthusiastically, with full intention of doing exactly that. And I'll tell you the day that pledge was abrogated. The day that was abrogated was the day this became personal. And as I said at the time, and I'm not going to get into criticizing or attacking Donald Trump, but I'll just give you this response. I am not in the habit of supporting people who attack my wife and attack my father. And that pledge was not a blanket commitment that if you go and slander and attack Heidi, that I'm going to nonetheless come like a servile puppy dog and say thank you very much for maligning my wife and maligning my father.
That's an excellent rebuttal, and exactly what Ben said last night, that he should say, hey, you attack my wife or you attack my dad, and when you want me to come and kiss your ring, I'm not going to do that.
I wouldn't do it. In a million years.
No way. And the pledge, first of all, Donald Trump said, and we talked about this last night, had the irony of the pledge. The pledge was about Donald Trump if he became the nominee, but he also broke the pledge. He said he wouldn't necessarily keep that pledge himself at least twice during the campaign subsequent to that. And he would not have kept that. The other thing about Ted Cruz is, let's not pretend that Ted Cruz would have been the nominee anyway as this outsider candidate, and that if he doesn't become the nominee at another time in the future, it has anything to do with what happened tonight. He's wildly unpopular. Had Donald Trump not been in the race, he would not have been the nominee. He just thought and sold himself as the candidate that could best defeat Donald Trump, which I never believed in the first place. But when Chris Christie tore down Marco Rubio, and when John Kasich couldn't get any traction, that was the end. But it would not, so Ted Cruz's future was not decided last night in favor or against. So I think that
I think that was an excellent rebuttal. So that's a great recovery.
The best thing I've ever heard Ted Cruz say.
That's right. Best argument he's ever made. Now, having said that, I still am in the camp of that was the Ted wedding, and some people are now calling it the Ted wedding. And he played the role of Walder Frey. And Walder Frey does not recover. There is no honor for Walder Frey.
There's pie.
Yeah. Once he sent his regards, it was over.
Yeah,
Okay. So because I feel, again, of course I could be wrong, but my sense of it was Republican voters going, screw you, and finally getting the sense of why all those people in D.C. hate him.
Even there,
That's
and
also
I think,
true. Yeah.
like Ben was right. This is how you defend yourself. And he did it. He did it right there. And I think a lot of people seeing that, like most people are going to be like, yeah, he did actually. He called your wife ugly. He said your father was an assassin. But it also demonstrated why I think Ted Cruz is always going to have a problem convincing a lot of people to vote for him. Because he has the right positions for the Republican Party and all of that. But he's just so distasteful. And there's something that reeks off of him. And even there, saying something that is probably true, that he was frustrated about the wife thing, he delivered it in a way that was fake. And when it first happened, when the retweet happened of that picture, and he said, you're a sniveling coward, he delivered it like it wasn't true. He can't even tell the truth without sounding like he's lying.
All these things are true. Cruz probably wasn't going to win anyway, and he's incredibly disliked, and he'll still be disliked unless he figures that out. And don't put it past him to figure it out. He's smart, right? But he has a way that seems repugnant, right? But what I'm surprised at is your lack of recognition, at least, that what that is, right or wrong, was a very powerful moment of strength from Ted Cruz, which is, I'm not backing down. This guy insulted my wife and my dad. No way, no way, no way. And so all of this then becomes, I think, if that works for you at all, this really becomes dependent on how Donald Trump does. And if Donald Trump is an embarrassing loser, then I just can't see how this harms Ted Cruz.
So
I think I agree.
So I know exactly what you're saying, and even in my interpretation, it is a hell of a thing to come in and tell that crowd you're not endorsing him. But I think what most people are feeling is, yeah, you could not endorse him. Yeah, you could be pissed at him for saying that about your wife or your dad, but you didn't have to come in here and spit in all our faces.